The house on Bellamy Street had grown quieter since their daughter left for college. Not silent exactly, just subdued, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something. Rachel thought about this often in the early evenings, when the sun filtered through the west-facing windows and painted the kitchen in gold. She liked this time, the quiet hour, when everything was still possible. But that evening, when she opened the lockbox in the garage, the world she thought she lived in came undone. It wasn't hidden particularly well, just under a pile of winter. Coats in a battered Rubbermaid tub. She'd been looking for her passport. The lockbox clicked open easily with the combination she'd used for years. Inside were the usual papers: marriage license, birth certificates, title to the car, and a second phone. Rachel held it as if it were radioactive. The screen lit up at her touch, the passcode unchallenging. Their wedding anniversary. A message popped up instantly. "Friday! Same place? I can't stop thinking about last time." She sat on the cold cement floor, the words tunneling into her like a drill. Chapter 2. The Arrangement. Matthew was at work, his voice drifting through Bluetooth when she called. "Hey, babe, what's up?" Rachel heard herself ask about dinner. Something mundane, something soft-edged. Her tone didn't betray her. She ended the call with, "Love you," and hung up before he could respond. She didn't know what she was going to do. Not yet. But she knew she couldn't confront him right away. Not before she understood who Friday was and what last time meant. For the next 3 days, she became someone else. A calm woman who made pasta, paid bills, laughed at sitcoms, all while her insides curled like scorched paper. She installed a tracking app on the secret phone. She told herself it was for clarity. Chapter 3. The Cafe Friday came. She followed him in her car, heart knocking against her ribs. He met a woman, mid-30s, sharp-angled and polished, at a cafe on 5th. They didn't touch, not right. Away. Just talked. Then the woman reached across the table and took his hand. Rachel took a photo with her phone. Chapter 4. The Confession. That night, she laid the phone on the kitchen counter. No theatrics, just silence. Matthew froze when he saw it. His first words were not denials, not anger. "Where did you find it?" That somehow hurt more than anything. Not, "I'm sorry," not, "It's not what you think," just logistics, damage control. "It's been going on for months," he admitted eventually, sitting at the edge of their bed like a boy in trouble. "Her name's Claire. I met her through a client." Rachel's voice, when it came, sounded foreign even to herself. "Is she in love with you?" "I don't know." "Are you in love with her?" "I don't think so. He sighed. It felt good to be wanted, to not feel like furniture. The words stabbed because they were true. She had stopped seeing him, not out of malice, but routine. Still, she said, "You don't cheat because you feel like furniture. You talk to me." I tried. Had he? She couldn't remember. Chapter 5. The visit Rachel visited Claire. She didn't plan to. She just drove to her office building and waited. When Claire emerged, she approached her directly. "I'm Matthew's wife." Claire didn't feign surprise. She nodded. "I figured. You'd find out, eventually. He said he wasn't in love with you." Claire gave a small, almost sympathetic smile. "He's lying to one of us." Chapter 6. The leak weeks passed. The betrayal thickened into something else. Investigation. Rachel noticed money missing from their joint account. Small amounts, then larger. A background check revealed Claire's real name was Clara Donnelly. 5 years ago, she'd been involved in a wire fraud case that never went to trial. Rachel found an old article. It wasn't an affair. It was a setup, and Matthew was being used. When she confronted him with this, he didn't react the way she expected. He was relieved. She said she could fix the deal I'd screwed up at work, he admitted. I let it go too far. I didn't know how to get out. Rachel stared at him. You slept with her to cover your ass? He didn't deny. Chapter 7. The Choice. The investigators came a month later. Rachel had already moved her savings to a separate account. She refused to lie for him. He was charged with embezzlement. Claire disappeared. The betrayal, she realized, was deeper than sex. It was cowardice. It was silence. But she still loved him in some bruised, bone-deep way. Final chapter. The house on Bellamy Street. Rachel stayed in the house. She painted the kitchen. She opened the windows. Sometimes she answered his letters from prison. Sometimes she didn't. In the quiet hour, she would sit with a glass of wine and try to remember who she used to be. Before lies, before lockboxes, she didn't know if she'd wait for him. She didn't know if she could forgive him, but she hadn't changed the locks. Not yet. Not literally. His voice wasn't on the radio, his face never on the news, but in the mornings, when the coffee maker clicked on, she would look toward the hallway expecting his footsteps. And in the shower, she'd catch herself humming the melody. He used to whistle without thinking, something from Fleetwood Mac, always just under his breath. It had been 6 months. Matthew had accepted a plea deal. 2 years, minimum security, white collar, no fences, just pine trees and therapy. Sessions, he wrote once a week. The letters were neither desperate nor angry. They were careful, edited, as if he were trying to tell the story in a way she might understand. She kept them all in a drawer. Sometimes she read them before bed. She told no one. Chapter 9. The Detective Sarah Miles arrived late one afternoon. Civil, not uniformed. She carried a clipboard and a cup of convenience store coffee. Miss Costello, she said, mind if I ask you a few questions about Clara Donnelly? Rachel blinked. You're still looking for her? She's connected to a larger fraud. Ring. We believe your husband was one of several men she targeted. Miles produced a photo. It was Clara, at a gas station in Phoenix. Smiling, alive, free. Rachel felt her pulse hammer in her throat. You think she's still working? Someone? We don't think she ever stopped. Rachel almost admired it. The precision, the quiet, the way Clara had studied Matthew long enough to know exactly how to undo him. She was good, Rachel admitted. Knew how to make herself seem like the thing you needed. Miles nodded. That's how these people operate. They're artists of need. Rachel wasn't sure whether to feel anger or relief that it hadn't been about love. Before she left, Miles added, if she ever contacts you, directly or indirectly, you need to let us know. Rachel lied. Of course. Chapter 10. The envelope 2 days later, an unmarked envelope appeared in Rachel's mailbox. Inside, a USB drive and a note. He wasn't the only one lying to you. Rachel stared at the flash drive on her kitchen counter. It felt like a choice. Open it and know everything, or destroy it and cling to the version of reality she had already survived. She waited 3 hours, then she plugged it into her laptop. Chapter 11. The footage. The USB contained video, files, 6 of them, all surveillance-style footage, hidden camera angles from what appeared to be hotel rooms, cafes, parking lots. Matthew was in every one, but so was Rachel. In one, she was shown at a charity auction, standing beside a man she barely remembered, a real estate broker named Harris Dunn. Clara had recorded them together, laughing, touching his arm. Rachel sat back, numb. She hadn't cheated, not physically, but there had been flirtation. Conversations she hadn't shared with Matthew, gaps in truth, ambiguities she'd allowed. In another clip, Clara could be seen watching them both, not just targeting Matthew, studying them as a couple. Rachel suddenly understood. It hadn't just been fraud. It was research, psychological warfare. Clara had inserted herself into their weakest places and pulled. Chapter 12. The call Rachel drove for 3 hours before she made the call. "Matt," she said when the prison line connected. "She sent me something." He didn't ask who. He knew. "She's still watching us." His voice dropped. "Did you see the video with the guy in the blue blazer?" "Harris Dunn. I barely knew him." "You looked like you wanted to." She closed her eyes. "Maybe I did." There was silence on the line. Heavy but not cruel. "I never hated you for what you felt," he said. "Just for not telling me." I could say the same. More silence. And then, "Rach, if I asked you to disappear with me when I get out, would you?" A long pause. "I don't know." Chapter 13. The storm in October. A nor'easter knocked out power on Bellamy Street for 2 days. Rachel lit candles and read Matthew's letters by firelight. The USB drive stayed in the drawer, along with her wedding ring. Detective Miles came again, this time with a warning. Clara had been spotted in New Haven. "She's bold," the detective said, "which usually means desperate." Rachel didn't sleep that night. She kept the porch light on. She was no longer afraid of Clara. She was afraid of what Clara knew, what she could expose. The quiet things. The moments Rachel had allowed to slip by. The betrayal, she realized, hadn't belonged to Matthew alone. Chapter 14. The Visit. 2. 16 months after his sentencing, Matthew was released. Rachel met him outside the prison. Neither of them spoke. He looked older. She looked stronger. He asked, "Still living in the house?" "For now." He nodded. "What about you?" she asked. "What do you want?" "I want to disappear." They stood there in the cold. No one else around. "Then let's disappear," Rachel said. Final chapter. The road, they didn't go far. Just north. Small towns, cheap motels. For a while, they changed their names. Found a rhythm. They talked more than they ever had in marriage. Sometimes about Clara. Sometimes about what it meant to choose the person who betrayed you. But some nights. Rachel still wondered if she'd made the wrong choice. And sometimes she didn't wonder at all. They became James and Elena Porter in a coastal town near Rockland, Maine. He worked part-time at a marina. She took up bookkeeping for a local vet. No one asked questions. It was a town that respected silence. They rented a small house with peeling, white paint, and a front porch that leaned slightly in the wind. It was humble, but after everything, it felt earned. Each morning they walked to the water. Each night they returned home separately, 10 minutes apart, a habit born from paranoia. Or guilt, or both. Trust was no longer assumed. It had to be built moment by moment, brick by shaky brick. And yet, there was laughter sometimes, and wine, and sex, awkward at first, but warm. There were mornings where Matthew woke first and made coffee the way she liked it, with cinnamon. Rachel found herself both comforted and unsettled by his tenderness. What did it mean to love the person who had betrayed you? More disturbingly, what did it mean to realize you might have betrayed them too? Epilogue 2. The message. 6 months into their new life, a postcard arrived. No return address, just a photo of a train station in Prague. On the back, a single line, did. "You really think you could erase me?" See, Rachel read it twice, then burned it in the sink. But she didn't tell Matthew. She had become him in a way, keeping pieces of truth to protect what they had, even if what they had was built on lies. That night, they danced in the kitchen to a scratchy old record. His hand on her waist felt familiar. Her smile was real. Almost. Epilogue. 3. A reckoning Rachel kept a journal now. Not of her thoughts, but of Clara's patterns, appearances, warnings. She traced back the footage, the contacts, the names Clara used before. The detective, Miles, had left her number. Rachel finally called. She contacted me, Rachel said. She knows where we are. You want protection? No, Rachel said. I want her. There was a pause on the line. I'm not sure what that means. I am. Epilogue 4. The final visit in a bar outside Montreal. Rachel saw her again. Clara had changed her hair, gone dark. She still dressed like someone who owned the room. You came alone, Clara said, smirking. No, Rachel replied. You just haven't seen the others yet. Two plainclothes officers took Clara as she reached for her glass. Her face didn't flinch. She was smiling as they cuffed her. Still don't trust him, do you? Clara called over her shoulder. Rachel didn't answer. She watched the car drive away, the red and blue lights flashing in a way that felt almost ceremonial. Final epilogue. V. Bellamy Street again. Years later, Rachel returned alone to the house on Bellamy Street. Matthew had left, gradually, gently. They had grown apart in peace. There had been no final fight, no screaming, just a quiet realization that what they had rebuilt had never stopped being a replica of something better. He left her with a letter. It ended simply, "You were the strongest person in the room, always. I wish I'd seen it sooner." She now taught literature at a community college. She drove the same car. She kept her own name again. But every evening at the quiet hour, she still lit a candle, and sometimes, when the wind was just right, she thought she could hear herself forgiving him. Or maybe just forgiving herself. Rachel didn't tell anyone she was moving back to Bellamy Street. Not even her daughter, Katie, who had graduated from college now and was teaching English in Portland. The house had been rented out in the interim to a quiet couple with cats and solar panels. When they moved out, Rachel came back with 2 suitcases and a single piece of art, an old oil painting of a lighthouse she'd bought on the Maine coast during those months of hiding. She hung it where the wedding photo used to be. The air in the house felt thinner, almost reverent. It had memory. It remembered pain, but it had good bones. So did she. Chapter 2. Katie's Questions. Katie visited one rainy weekend in March. She noticed the absence of Matthew's things immediately. "Mom," she asked over breakfast, "did you ever actually forgive him?" Rachel stirred her tea for too long. "I forgave the version of him who admitted what he did, but I never met the version who would have told me the truth before he got caught." Katie nodded. She was quiet for a while, then said, "I think I inherited your ability to survive things." Rachel looked out the window and murmured, "It's not always a gift." Chapter 3. The visitor. One night in early summer, there was a knock at the door. It was Matthew. He looked, well, healthier, softer. He wore a windbreaker and held a paper bag with a bottle of Malbec inside. "I figured I owed you a drink," he said. Rachel didn't let him in right away. When she did, they didn't hug. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table. "Why now?" she asked. He hesitated. "Because I'm finally the version of myself I should have been 10 years ago, and I don't want to be him without showing you." They didn't drink much, but they talked. Not about Clara, not about the affair, just about things in between. Books, weather, Katie, the ways life had changed shape. When he left, he kissed her cheek. She cried for an hour after, not because she still loved him, but because she finally didn't. Chapter 4. A new man that fall. Rachel met someone new. His name was Marcus Weller, a widower, a quiet man with strong hands and a softness behind the eyes. He ran the used bookstore downtown. He was patient with her silence. He never asked for more than she offered. She didn't tell him everything, not at first. But slowly she let pieces slip out. Like a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted him to solve. One night, when they were walking along the river trail and the sky was copper with sunset, He asked, "Would you ever get married again?" Rachel smiled. "To the right kind of question, I would say yes." He looked puzzled. She added, "But that wasn't the right kind of question." Chapter 5. Ghosts. Some nights she dreamed of Clara. Not in fear, but in fascination. In the dream. Clara was always standing across a table, poker-faced, holding a mirror. When Rachel looked in it, she didn't see herself. She saw versions. Rachel as wife, Rachel as liar, Rachel as lover, Rachel as victim. She always woke up before the mirror cracked. One morning she sat at her writing desk and drafted a short story. She called it The Mirror Thief. She sent it to a small literary magazine under a pseudonym. They published it. She didn't tell anyone. Chapter 6. What remains years passed. The house aged. So did she. Matthew sent a Christmas card once. Katie got married. Marcus moved in quietly, without ceremony. One evening, sitting on the porch swing, Marcus turned to her and said, "You never told me what really happened." With him. With her. Rachel thought about the USB drive in the locked drawer, about the videos, the postcard, the fire, the kiss on the cheek. She sipped her tea and said, "Some stories are meant to stay unfinished." He didn't ask again. Final chapter. The quiet hour. Again. At 62, Rachel sat at her desk one autumn afternoon and wrote the final chapter of a novel she'd been working on secretly for years. It was about a woman who lost everything, then remade herself one fragment at a time. She didn't know what would happen to the book, but she knew this much. Forgiveness wasn't something you gave all at once. It was something you practiced, like piano scales, until the noise quieted down and all that remained was music. Outside, the leaves turned amber and red. The quiet hour had returned. This time, it didn't feel like waiting. It felt like peace. 3 months after her short story was published, Rachel received a letter postmarked from a literary agent in New York. It was addressed to her pseudonym E.R. Colton, a name she'd chosen as a nod to her grandmother and her maiden name. C.B. Agent had read her piece in Ember Quarterly and wanted to know, was she working on a novel? Rachel read the letter 3 times before setting it down. She hadn't told Marcus about the story, or the name, or the version of herself that still lived in the margins of what she didn't say. She sat with that truth all evening. Then, quietly, she began to write back. Chapter 2. The book within the book. The novel came quickly. It wasn't about Clara, not directly. But she was there, in shadows and gestures. So was Matthew. So was Rachel herself, fragmented across characters who lied and hurt and loved anyway. She titled it, The Woman at the Window Seat, a reference to a scene where the protagonist watches her life pass from a train, uncertain if she's running, away or finally arriving. Marcus noticed she was disappearing into her office more. She lied and told him she was journaling, and part of her was. The other part was remembering. Chapter 3. Katie finds the story. Katie called her one evening. Voice electric. Mom, did you write a story under the name E.R. Colton? Rachel froze. Where did you see that name? One of my students brought in the story. The Mirror Thief. She said she read it online and it reminded her of you. Rachel didn't answer right away. Mom, I wrote it. Yes. There was a long pause. Why didn't you tell me? Rachel's voice was a whisper. Because telling people about the story meant reopening the real one. Katie didn't push. I'm glad you wrote it, even if it hurt. Rachel cried after the call, not because of shame, but because her daughter saw her, really saw her. Chapter 4. Marcus reads the manuscript. She gave it to him in the spring, wrapped, in brown paper, placed on his desk in the bookstore after closing. When he read it, he didn't speak for a day. Then 2. On the 3rd night, he came into the kitchen with a glass of wine and set the manuscript on the counter. "I'm not sure if I'm in this," he said, "or if I'm just what came after." Rachel looked up. "Do you need to be in it?" he thought. "No, but I needed to know it wasn't a lie." "It isn't," she said. "None of it was." He touched her hand. "You're braver than I ever realized." She looked down at their hands. "I wasn't brave when it happened. I was just trying to survive." He didn't let go. Chapter 5. Publication. The book was published a year later by a mid-sized press known for literary fiction and quiet thunder. She still used E.R. Colton, but interviews came, and a podcast, and one photo in a bookstore newsletter that Katie shared on her Instagram, captioned simply, "My mother wrote her way out of a life that nearly erased her. Proud doesn't even cover it." Rachel sat on her porch the night the book hit shelves. A fan tagged her in a post calling the book a meditation on betrayal and rebirth. She wasn't sure if that was true, but she liked the sound of it. Final chapter. The Beach House. On her 65th birthday, Marcus rented them a small cottage on the Oregon coast. They stayed for a week, reading and walking and watching gulls scream into the wind. On the last night, Rachel stood at the edge of the surf and whispered something into the Pacific. She whispered Clara's name. She whispered Matthew's. She whispered her own, slowly, as if learning it for the first time. Then she turned and walked back toward the firelight, where Marcus waited, holding a blanket and a bottle of wine, and not needing to ask what she'd said. Because some endings don't need explanation. They just need witnessing. It began with an email. The subject line was blank, the sender unlisted, but the message was short. "Nice story. You left out the part where you chose him again." See, Rachel stared at the screen. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. She typed, deleted, retyped. In the end, she didn't reply, but she didn't delete it either. Chapter 2. A bookstore confrontation. At a signing in Seattle, a woman approached her table. Mid-40s. Expensive coat. Pale pink lipstick that didn't smile. "You changed the ending," the woman said without introducing herself. "I'm sorry?" The woman in the book, she forgives him, walks away from the affair but keeps the man. "That's not what happened in real life, is it?" Rachel kept her voice calm. "The book isn't a memoir. But it is, isn't it? Just one where you get to lie out loud." Rachel signed the woman's copy, then met her eyes. "I wrote the truth I could survive. That's all anyone can do." The woman left without her book. Chapter 3. Marcus withdraws. He didn't say it at first, but Rachel felt it in the way he paused now before reaching for her. How he lingered longer on headlines about her book than on her words at dinner. Finally, one night, as she was brushing her teeth, he said through the open bathroom door, "Do you think you'd still have written it if I'd asked you not to?" She stared at her reflection. Her voice was careful. "Yes." Marcus nodded, slow and silent. "That's what I thought." He didn't leave, not immediately, but something in him did. Chapter 4. A second edition. Rachel's publisher wanted to add a new preface to the paperback, something reflective, personal, tied to the book's themes of betrayal, rebirth, and accountability. She stared at the blank page for hours. Then she wrote, "Some stories don't end. They echo. They revisit us when we least expect them. What I've learned is this: honesty doesn't mean telling everything. Sometimes it means knowing when to stop rewriting the past and start living with it instead." She signed it E.R. Colton. But This time, she added her real name below it. Chapter 5. A knock at the door late autumn. Evening. A knock at the door, not the front, the side, near the kitchen, where the lights were off. Rachel opened it slowly, phone in hand, heart bracing. It wasn't Clara, it was Matthew. He looked older, weathered, but oddly peaceful. "I read the book," he said. Rachel stood in the doorway, her hand on the frame. "That wasn't for you." "I know. That's why it hurt." A long pause. "I came to say thank you," he said. "For what?" "For telling your version, even if it made me the villain." She stepped outside, closing the door behind her. "You were never the villain," she said. "You were just human. And I was human too. That's the part no one wants to hear." He nodded. Neither of them asked to stay. He walked away. She watched him go, and this time, she didn't cry. Final chapter, the window seat. Again. Rachel took a train across the country the following spring. No reason, no schedule, just a window seat and a notebook. In a quiet compartment, she wrote, "What remains isn't love or hate or clarity. What remains is the choice, to carry the pain or to compost it. Let it rot and feed something new." She closed the notebook and looked out the window. The landscape blurred, but her reflection in the glass, older, sharper, unapologetic, held steady. She smiled at herself, just once, then turned back to the page and kept writing. Rachel was invited to speak at the Evergreen Writers Conference in Aspen. She was given a suite in a glassy hotel built into the mountains, where the air was so thin it made her lightheaded and dreamy. Her keynote was scheduled for the final evening, in the big tent. The topic: writing the self without confession. She walked out in a black coat, silver hair twisted loosely at the neck, and silence followed her to the podium. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Then she began. "We say writing is truth-telling, but what we mean is someone's truth. A fragment, a distortion filtered through memory and guilt and language. It's not therapy, it's not confession, it's performance. And if it's done right, sometimes it sets you free anyway." People clapped. Some stood, but Rachel knew one thing they didn't. She had rewritten the ending of her book twice, once for the publisher, once for herself. The real ending still lived in a folder on her old laptop, unpublished, unsent. Chapter 2. Clara's trial news broke the following spring. Clara Delaney, charged with 2 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of identity theft, and obstruction. A minor trial, no cameras. But Rachel watched it unfold online. A local blogger posted courtroom sketches. One image caught Rachel's breath. Clara sitting in the witness box, head tilted, arms crossed, smirking. Still theatrical, still magnetic. The article ended with a quote from the closing arguments. "Some people don't want money or revenge. They want narrative control. Clara Delaney understood that more than anyone in this courtroom." Rachel stared at that line for a long time. Then she opened her old laptop and began editing the real ending. Chapter 3. Marcus leaves. Quietly. They hadn't fought in months. That was part of the problem. Marcus was kind, steady, present. But he was not curious anymore. One morning, over toast and marmalade, he said, "I've been offered a position in Vermont, curating a private collection. I think I'm going to take it." Rachel nodded slowly. "And this is goodbye?" "I think it has been for a while." They hugged at the station. No tears, no drama. When the train pulled away, she felt something. Surprising, not grief, not relief, just space. Chapter 4. Katie's son, Katie, had a baby in June. A boy. She named him Elijah. Rachel held him in the hospital, blinking through tears. For the first time in years, She didn't think about Matthew or Clara or Marcus or anyone who had ever lied to her or asked her to lie. She thought only of the weight in her arms, the tiny breath against her chest, the newness of him. He didn't know her as a writer, or a wife, or a woman who'd once disappeared to save herself. He just knew her heartbeat, and she knew that was enough. Final chapter, Archive Box. 5 years later, a graduate student at a liberal arts college in Oregon was archiving the papers of the Yasir, now renowned writer E.R. Colton. She opened a battered manila folder labeled Unpublished for Posthumous Review Only. Inside, she found a letter, a memoir draft, and a note. "This is the truest version. It's also the one no one was ready for. I leave it behind not for vindication, but for honesty. Let someone else decide what parts of me should be remembered. I." Student looked up. Outside, the coastal fog rolled in slow and low. She read the first paragraph and shivered. Then she placed the folder gently into box number 14 and labeled it, Colton E.R. R. Bellamy, Truth Variations 2025. Her name was Talia Quinn, and she didn't know much about E.R. Colton beyond the basics. The literature professors all revered her work, The Woman at the Window Seat, The Mirror Thief, and the posthumously published Variations on the Truth. A trilogy, they called it now. Talia had been assigned to process the donated archive for her graduate fellowship. She'd imagined she'd be sorting old royalty contracts and dusty award letters. What she found instead were layers, marginalia in Rachel Bellamy's elegant slanted handwriting, fragments of conversations never spoken aloud, multiple drafts of the same scene, each with different endings, different emotional truths. It was box number 14 that haunted her most. Inside was the memoir, the real one. It was full of redactions, names crossed out, some replaced with letters, others left as blanks. But the emotional candor was surgical, devastating. Rachel had written like someone who didn't care if the world flinched. The final line was scribbled in pencil, nearly illegible. "You don't recover from the story. You learn how to carry it without dragging." Talia closed the file and pressed her palm against it, like it might still be warm from the hand that wrote it. She didn't know what had happened to Clara Delaney or to Matthew Bellamy, but she knew what had happened to Rachel. She had become the story. On her own terms, and in doing so, she'd rewritten the rules of how a life, a betrayal, a woman could be remembered. Last scene, the porch light a cottage by the Oregon coast, overgrown with dune grass and lupine, stood empty now. Dust settled on the porch swing. Inside, on a weathered writing desk, sat an open journal. One line remained half-written. "If you're reading this, then I've already—" The pen lay beside it. Outside, the wind rattled the chimes. The porch light flickered on by itself, as it always did at dusk, and somewhere far away, a woman who once survived betrayal by telling the truth, with silence, with ink, with fire, was finally quiet, not because she was erased, but because her words had already outlived her. University of Oregon, Winter, 2040. The course was titled Women and the Ethics of Self-Narrative. The final week focused on E.R. Colton. 20 students sat in a semicircle, annotated paperbacks and tablets open, margins filled with notes. Professor, Lena Sorensen, barefoot, gray-streaked hair twisted at her crown, leaned against the desk. She'd been a writer once, years ago. Now, she preferred to study the ones who had dared more. "Let's talk about the ending of Variations on the Truth," she said. "Why do you think she waited to publish it after her death?" A quiet student, Grace, barely 20, always watching, raised her hand. "Because she wasn't trying to be absolved," Grace said. "She was trying to be honest. And she knew those aren't always the same thing." The room stilled. Professor Sorensen smiled. "Exactly." Colton knew something most memoirists never admit, that the price of truth is often isolation. but the reward is freedom. She turned to the chalkboard and wrote, "The story doesn't save you. It just makes you visible." When she looked back, half the class had written it down. Postscript 2. The reader, at an airport bookstore in Prague, a middle-aged woman picked up a copy of The Woman at the Window Seat. She was killing time on a layover, looking for something slim and quiet. She read the first paragraph while standing, then the second. By the third, she was sitting cross-legged between the shelves, fully gone. When the announcement for boarding came, she bought the book without closing it. On the plane, turbulence jolted her during a scene in which the protagonist confronts a woman who's stolen her identity. The woman on the plane held the book tighter, her heart pounding. Tears threatening for reasons she couldn't explain. She didn't know E.R. Colton was once a woman named Rachel Bellamy. She didn't know about Matthew or Clara or Oregon or betrayal. She only knew what the story made her feel, that it was possible to survive the unspeakable, and that sometimes survival didn't look like winning. It looked like writing it down anyway. Final image. The tide. The sea keeps moving. It forgets no names, but it whispers none. On the edge of the Pacific, gulls circle above the old cottage, now shuttered but still, standing. The wind moves through its eaves like breath through an instrument. And somewhere in a drawer, behind a pane of dusty glass, a journal lies open to a page still waiting. The tide inches closer, but the words remain. Title: E.R. Colton. Memory, Myth, and the Mirror. A small room. Dim lighting. Glass cases line the walls. Inside, notebooks, typewritten pages, photographs, a strand of white hair taped beside a fountain pen, a broken mug with a bookstore logo, a single earring, silver, spiral-shaped. At the far end of the room, there's a wooden chair and a pair of headphones resting atop a weathered table. A sign reads, "Audio recording, Rachel Bellamy, 2024, for the archive." A woman in her 60s, visiting alone, sits down, puts the headphones on, presses play. Rachel's voice, older but firm, comes through, crackling slightly. "You think the hard part is what they did to you, the betrayal, the lie, but the hard part is what you do with the story afterward. Do you rewrite it? Lock it away? Turn it into art? And let strangers interpret it until it's no longer yours?" She exhales softly. "I used to believe telling the truth would set me free. What I've learned is, telling the truth binds you, to memory, to other people's perceptions, to what you leave unsaid." A pause, then quieter. "But silence is its own kind of violence." The woman listening touches her own, face without realizing she's crying. Rachel's voice one last time. "I don't regret the writing or the life. I regret the years I spent narrating myself for someone else's comfort." The tape ends. The visitor sits still for a long while. Then she stands, exits into the gray light of a coastal afternoon. Behind her, a docent quietly flips. The now playing sign back to ready. Final image, a young girl. Reading a teenager, maybe 14, reads The Mirror Thief in the school library. She's dog-eared a passage, written something in the margins. The bell rings. She tucks the book under her arm. She walks out differently than she walked in. She doesn't know the author's real name. She doesn't know the betrayals behind the prose, but she knows one thing. The voice in those pages made her feel seen, and somehow, across time, across grief, across pages filled with unspeakable things, Rachel Bellamy spoke back. End. A classroom at a university in San Francisco. The blackboard is dusty, the windows open to the quiet hum of the city outside. Students of various ages and backgrounds are clustered in rows, but at the front there's a new professor, young, fresh-faced, and poised with a book in her hand. Dr. Lila Moreno has just begun her first semester teaching literary identity in women writers, a graduate-level seminar. She holds up a well-worn copy of The Woman at the Window Seat and smiles. "This novel," she says, looking at her students, "has been part of my life for over a decade. I first read it when I was in graduate school. It felt like the book had been written for me. It was more than fiction. It was survival. It made me believe that maybe, just maybe, I could write my own story too." The students exchange looks. Lila places the book on the desk. And for the next hour, we're going to explore why Rachel Bellamy, under her pen name E.R. Colton, created a new kind of narrative. One where betrayal isn't just an event. It's a question, a choice, a cycle. A hand raises. A student asks, "But what about the ending? It's so ambiguous. Why didn't she give us a clear resolution?" Lila smiles softly. "Because real life doesn't offer resolutions. It gives us echoes, and those echoes ripple out, far beyond what we can see." The class sits in silence, contemplating. Chapter 2. A New Writer's Letter. A letter arrives, handwritten in blue ink, addressed to Dr. Lila Moreno, Faculty Office, Department of English. It's postmarked from a small town on the Oregon coast. Inside is a single sheet of paper. "Dear Dr. Moreno, I hope you don't mind me writing to you. My name is Iris Hawthorne. I'm a writer, and I've recently finished reading The Woman at the Window Seat. I know this might sound strange, but I felt like I had to reach out. That book, it spoke to me in a way no other story has. I've been working on a novel of my own, one that touches on themes of betrayal and reinvention, though I don't think I'll ever capture the depth of what Rachel Bellamy did in hers. But I just wanted to say thank you for making me believe that my own voice matters. I hope you don't mind me sending this. But if you do, I understand." With gratitude, Iris Hawthorne Lila reads the letter, her hand trembling as she places it down. She's been reading Rachel Bellamy's work for years, and she had always assumed the ripples of those words were behind her, history. But this letter, this one, feels different. It feels like the beginning of something new. Lila picks up her pen and begins to write a response. Chapter 3. A Modern World. Iris Hawthorne's debut novel, Tangled Lines, was released in 2046. It didn't become an instant bestseller, but it slowly garnered a devoted following. The novel was deeply personal, written in a fragmented, unreliable narrative that mirrored the way the protagonist's life unraveled after a betrayal. Critics compared it to The Woman at the Window Seat. Some called it derivative, others said it was a brave continuation of what Rachel Bellamy had started. Iris didn't mind the comparison. She had written the novel for herself, to understand the pain she'd been carrying. But now, as her book made its way into readers' hands, she felt a responsibility. She knew that her words would echo in their minds, just as Rachel's had echoed in hers. And maybe, just maybe, someone would read it the way she had read Rachel's, like a lifeline. Chapter 4. The Museum. Again, at the Oregon Literary History Museum, an exhibition is being expanded. It's been 10 years since Rachel Bellamy's name was first inducted into the museum's permanent collection. The museum has grown, and now the narrative around Rachel's legacy feels like a monument, an artifact of cultural history. E.R. Colton is remembered, but Rachel Bellamy, the woman behind the name, is still a ghost. The curators are working to piece together an interactive timeline, including a recent acquisition, a letter from Iris Hawthorne to Dr. Lila Moreno. And in the corner of the room, a new plaque has been added under the title of Rachel's first published work. The story we tell does not just belong to us. It belongs to every person we've ever touched, and every person they will touch. It is alive in 1,000 versions. Final chapter. Passing the torch. It's another quiet evening in Portland. Lila Moreno is at home. a cup of chamomile tea in hand as she looks at the newest edition of Tangled Lines, Iris Hawthorne's book. She flips through it, smiling at the echoes of Rachel's work in these new pages. In her heart, she knows the cycle has only just begun. The words will continue. The stories will continue. And in the end, they'll be passed on in the quietest of ways, through letters, through novels, through voices that are just beginning to find their truth. And Rachel, in some small way, will always be there. End. Lila Moreno stared at the half-finished manuscript on her desk. It had been sitting there for weeks, but tonight it felt heavier than ever. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but no words came. She had been trying to write a book of her own for years now, but every time she sat down to start, she couldn't help but think of Rachel Bellamy. The weight of E.R. Colton's work loomed over her like an ever-present shadow. Her students had loved Rachel's work. They'd seen in it a kind of truth, a rawness that was difficult to ignore. And Lila couldn't help but wonder, had Rachel known all along that her voice would outlive her? That it would shape generations of writers? Or had she simply written to survive without a single thought for how the world might take her words? Lila had written to survive once, too. She had poured her soul into a handful of poetry collections that no one had cared about, and then shifted to teaching, to something more stable. But Rachel's success was different. It was profound. It wasn't just the books themselves. It was the way Rachel had dared to lay her life bare, allowing her truth to become the world's to interpret. Lila sighed and closed the manuscript. The weight of Rachel's legacy was suffocating. She had become too much of a curator of someone else's story, and yet here she was, still trying to tell her own. Chapter 2. Iris's Struggle. Iris Hawthorne sat in her small apartment, the final draft of her next novel spread out before her. She had done it again. She had poured her heart into this story, just as she had with her first book. But this time, it was different. She had been careful, thoughtful. She was no longer writing just for herself. She was writing for her readers, and she was writing for Rachel Bellamy. Her first novel, Tangled Lines, had been received well. It hadn't set the world on fire, but it had connected with a smaller audience. But in her heart, Iris knew it hadn't been enough. It hadn't captured the complexity, the depth of what Rachel's books had. The way Rachel had been able to speak to the silent places inside people, the places they didn't dare to touch. Iris had always admired that. But the more she wrote, the more she felt the pressure. She couldn't escape the comparison to Rachel. She didn't want to, but she did. Was she trying to be Rachel? Was she trying to build her own identity on the foundations of someone else's pain? It felt like a betrayal in itself, a quiet betrayal that lingered just beneath the surface of her writing. Iris tapped her pen against the desk and stared at the screen. She was no longer sure where her own voice began and Rachel's ended. She wondered if she would ever find her way without being swallowed by the shadows of the woman who had unknowingly paved the way for her. Chapter 3. The interview It had been 3 years since Lila had first heard from Iris. Now, the two women were sitting across from each other, in a sunlit cafe in Portland, sipping tea. Their conversation was warm, but there was an underlying tension. "Do you ever think you'll stop writing about Rachel?" Lila asked, her voice quiet, unsure whether she wanted an answer. Iris hesitated, taking a slow sip of her tea before responding. "I don't know if I can. It's like she's always there. Her words, her choices. They've shaped so much of what I've become as a writer and as a person. I didn't ask for it, but it's true." Lila nodded. "It's the curse of her legacy, isn't it? It feels like we're all just passing through, trying to hold on to something that doesn't belong to us." Iris leaned forward, her hands clasped together. "But maybe that's what makes the work real. It's not just about owning it. It's about carrying it forward like a story that never ends. Rachel's work, it was always about survival, wasn't it? The fight to keep going even when you don't have control over the way people tell your story. Lila sighed, her eyes distant. I think Rachel would have hated the idea of being idolized, turned into a symbol. She was too real for that. But isn't that what happens to all of us? Iris asked softly. We don't get to choose how we're remembered. We only get to live, and maybe we get to write it down. Lila smiled bitterly, then shook her head. Maybe. Chapter 4. The Breakthrough. Several months later, Lila finally finished her book. It was nothing like Rachel's. In fact, it felt like a quiet rebellion against the weight of Rachel's influence. It was personal, unflinching, and raw. There were no grand ideas about legacy or truth, only a woman grappling with her own identity. When Iris read it, she was moved. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest in the way Rachel's work had been. It was a kind of defiance against the notion that anyone else's story could define her, that someone else's truth could weigh heavier than her own. The day the book was published, Lila sent Iris a short message. I think I'm done carrying someone else's narrative. Iris replied almost immediately. Good. It's time to carry your own. And for the first time, Lila felt free. Chapter 5. The Letter In. The final moments of Rachel Bellamy's life, she had written countless letters, some to lovers, some to friends, others to herself. But one, a letter to her younger self, was never meant to be seen. Dear Rachel, I know you are afraid. You are afraid of being alone, afraid of being forgotten. But remember this. You are not the sum of what others think of you. You are not the pieces they pick up when you're broken. You are the story you choose to tell. When you decide finally to let go of the past, you will find peace, but only if you remember that forgiveness is not an act of charity. It is an act of self-preservation. The pain is yours to carry, but you do not have to carry it alone. Let the world believe whatever it will, but you are enough. With love, Rachel. Final chapter. A new beginning. The story didn't end. It never truly does. The world spins, people change, stories echo across generations. Years later, in a dusty corner of a bookstore, a young woman finds a well-worn copy of The Woman at the Window Seat. She opens it, drawn by something she can't quite explain. She reads a few pages, then flips to the end. There's no neat resolution, no tidy conclusion. But somehow, that makes sense to her. She closes the book with a soft sigh, and the cycle begins again. Lila Moreno stood before the window of her apartment in Portland, staring out at the city, her mind a haze of thoughts. It had been nearly 2 years since she had released her book, and though it had found its audience, the quiet life she'd imagined for herself wasn't coming to pass. There were still invitations to lecture, still articles about her book in literary journals. The world hadn't forgotten her yet. She had once thought that when she finished writing, she'd be free. But it seemed that the more she wrote about herself, the more the past crept up behind her. Her phone buzzed with an incoming email. She opened it absent-mindedly. It was a message from Iris Hawthorne. Lila, I've been thinking about something you said a while ago, about how we can't escape our past, that it follows us in unexpected ways. I think you were right. It's been haunting me, this thing about Rachel. Her voice, still echoing in my head. Sometimes it feels like I'm trying to outrun it. But then I read your book again, and I realized, maybe that's what we're all doing. We're not trying to outrun the past. We're trying to rewrite it. Let's talk soon. I'm coming to Portland next week. I'd love to see you. Iris Lila. set the phone down, and closed her eyes. The ghosts of Rachel's work still loomed, not just for Iris, but for her too. She had thought she'd been telling her own story, but hadn't she in some way been telling Rachel's? The struggle to find truth in the fragments of memory, the blurred lines of what was real and what had been rewritten over time. It was as though Rachel's voice had never truly left her. Chapter 2. The new book Iris had not written in over a year. The pressure of living up to her first success had choked her creativity, and the weight of Rachel's legacy had only made it harder. But she'd been thinking more about the past lately, about Rachel's life, her choices, the way the woman had fought to write her own truth. And Iris knew now that she had been looking in the wrong places for her own story. In the quiet hours of the morning, Iris sat in front of her desk and finally typed the first words of a new manuscript. It wasn't about Rachel. It wasn't about the past. It was about a woman trying to understand herself, to reclaim her own narrative without feeling the pressure of someone else's. But as she wrote, Iris realized something. Her story was always going to be a reflection of what had come before her. She couldn't outrun the echo of Rachel Bellamy, or Lila, or the stories that had shaped her. Still, there was power in choosing how to tell it. Chapter 3. The Unfinished. Conversation Lila sat at a cafe in Portland, her fingers wrapped around a cup of tea, waiting for Iris. It had been months since they last saw each other in person, but their emails had kept the connection alive. Lila had almost forgotten how much she missed this. Talking, really talking, without the weight of the world watching. When Iris walked in, Lila noticed the change in her. The young woman who had once come to her for advice seemed now to have found some quiet strength. She looked different, less burdened. "I finished it," Iris said quietly, sitting across from Lila, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Finished what?" Lila asked, though she already knew the answer. "The new manuscript." Iris pulled a few printed pages from her bag and slid them across the table. Lila glanced at the title on the first page, "The Lines Between Us." It was simple, unassuming, but there was something about it that made Lila pause. She picked up the pages and began reading, each word like a new heartbeat. As she read, Lila realized that Iris had done it. She had found her own voice. She had broken free from the chains of comparison, of legacy, and she had crafted a story that was uniquely hers. "I think you've finally done it," Lila said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've written your own story." Iris nodded slowly. "I think I have. But it's also Rachel's story. And yours. And mine. Because in the end, our stories are always connected. We can't really separate ourselves from the people who came before us, can we?" Lila didn't answer right away. Instead, she let the silence hang between them, the weight of it a shared understanding. "No," Lila said after a long pause, "we can't. But that doesn't mean we're not allowed to keep writing." Chapter 4. The Future Unknown Months. Passed, and Iris's new book, The Lines Between Us, was published to critical acclaim. It wasn't the book she had originally set out to write, but it was the one that had come from her heart. It was a story of a woman who, much like Rachel, had been forced to reckon with the past, her family, her history, the decisions she couldn't undo. But it was also a story of how the future could still be shaped, even when the past seemed to overshadow it. The book wasn't a reconciliation of all things, but rather a testament to the complexity of human life, how we carry what we can't change, but also how we can choose what to let go. And Lila, too, found peace. Not because she had finally escaped Rachel's influence, but because she had embraced it. She had let Rachel's story live on as it was meant to, but she had written her own ending. An ending that didn't require approval, that didn't depend on the world's interpretation. In a quiet corner of the city, Lila sat at a cafe, her own book resting on the table beside her. A woman walked by, glancing at the cover, then stopping to read the back. Lila smiled softly. This was what it meant, to leave a mark. Not in the way others would remember you, but in the way your words, your story, would shape their lives. In the end, we all write our own histories, whether we're ready to or not. Final reflection. Legacy rewritten. The stories we tell are not just ours. They belong to the ones who listen, the ones who read, the ones who carry them forward. Rachel Bellamy's name may never be forgotten, but her story, like all stories, will continue to evolve. Every reader, every writer who connects with her words will find their own meaning, their own truth. And in that, Rachel, E.R. Colton, will always be alive. End. Lila sat at her writing desk, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across her room. The manuscript she had been working on lay before her, now complete. She had written a story of survival, of identity, of loss. But it was not the story of Rachel Bellamy, not anymore. She had meant for her writing to be liberating, to free herself from the weight of someone else's narrative. But no matter how far she tried to move from Rachel's shadow, it still loomed over her. Lila had spent her whole life teaching students about the power of stories, about the importance of telling your own truth. Yet somehow she couldn't escape the feeling that even in her own book, the echoes of Rachel's words still clung to her, suffocating her attempts at self-expression. She had read Iris's new novel, The Lines Between Us, and felt a jolt of recognition. It was a book that spoke to the struggle of reconciling the past with the present, of living with the weight of familial and societal expectations, and of trying to build something that was truly her own. In a way, Lila envied Iris's ability to write with such freedom. Iris had done it, had found her own voice, had made peace with the past while still moving forward. Lila set down her pen and ran a hand through her hair. Maybe the time had come for her to truly write her own story without hiding behind the constructs of others' legacies. She had spent so long thinking she was defined by the shadow of Rachel's words, but maybe the story she needed to tell was not just about Rachel's legacy, but about how she had come to define herself in its presence. Chapter 2. A Last Conversation. Iris had been receiving emails from Lila for weeks now, sporadic and thoughtful, but there was a lingering sense of unfinished business between them. Iris had found a quiet corner of the literary world for herself with her new book, but even now her thoughts were often consumed by Rachel's words, the lingering effects of being connected to someone who had shaped her, even without ever meeting her. So she decided it was time to go back to Portland and speak to Lila in person. There were things unsaid between them. Maybe Lila was ready to acknowledge what they both knew, that their connection to Rachel had shaped their own identities, for better or worse. The cafe was quiet, the kind of place where you could lose yourself in the hum of low conversations, the clink of ceramic cups. Iris arrived early, sitting at a corner table waiting for Lila. When Lila walked in, she looked different, lighter somehow, as though she had finally made peace with something. She looked at Iris with a quiet smile, taking a seat across from her. "I've been reading your work," Lila began, her tone soft. "And I think it's incredible, Iris. You've really found your voice." Iris shifted in her seat, uncomfortable with the compliment. "I don't know about that," she said. "I still feel like there's so much more to figure out. But I think I'm starting to understand that I can't run from the past. It's not about escaping Rachel's legacy or even defining myself apart from her. It's about accepting what she left me and moving forward with it." Lila took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about that too. For so long, I thought I was the curator of Rachel's legacy, the one who had to preserve it, keep it safe for future generations. But I realize now that her words, they don't belong to me anymore. They belong to anyone who reads them. To anyone who takes something away from them. Iris nodded slowly, understanding what Lila meant. It's like what you said in your book. The past is never really gone. It's in everything we do, in every choice we make. And that's the thing, isn't it? Lila said, leaning forward. We've all been writing our own stories all along, even when we didn't realize it. Rachel's story didn't end when she died. It continues in all of us. The two women sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling around them. There were no easy answers. There would never be a clean break from the past, but perhaps that was the point. Maybe the point wasn't to escape it, but to transform it, to weave it into something new. Chapter 3. A Quiet Revolution. Months passed, and life in Portland continued as usual. Lila finished a second manuscript, one that finally felt like her own, free from the expectations, free from the legacy that had weighed so heavily on her. She didn't write about Rachel Bellamy. She wrote about the spaces in between, the quiet moments of rebellion, of acceptance, of learning to live without the ever-watchful gaze of the past. The book wasn't a bestseller, but it was real. It was true. Iris, too, found herself working on a new manuscript. But this time, the story felt different. It wasn't just a continuation of the past. It was a reflection of everything she had learned in her journey to accept her own identity. She didn't need Rachel Bellamy's shadow to shape her voice. She had her own story to tell. When Iris published her third novel, Shadows of Ourselves, it wasn't with the fanfare of her first book, but it resonated deeply with a small, devoted audience. It was a book about healing, about the complexities of family, of finding strength in places one hadn't expected. It was a book about rewriting the story of who you were without erasing the parts that hurt. In their own ways, both Lila and Iris had come to understand something. Rachel's legacy was no longer just about the stories she told. It was about how those stories had changed the lives of everyone who encountered them, whether it was the people who read them or the people who, years later, tried to write their own truths. Chapter 4. A New Conversation on a Crisp Autumn. Day, Lila and Iris sat together on the steps of the Oregon Literary History Museum. They hadn't planned this meeting, but it felt natural, like it had been waiting to happen for years. Lila turned to Iris, a thoughtful expression on her face. I think in the end, we all have to make peace with the stories we inherit. But we also have to take ownership of them. We're not just defined by the past. We can change it. Iris looked out at the street, where the city bustled in its usual way. You're right. It's not just about surviving the past, it's about rewriting it. And maybe that's what Rachel was trying to do too. Maybe her books were about giving us permission to do the same. Maybe, Lila agreed. But the point is that we don't have to be bound by the legacy of someone else's story. We can write our own endings however we choose. The two women sat together in comfortable silence, watching the world go by. They had learned through their struggles and through their pain that the future was theirs to shape, and that in itself was a kind of freedom. And this continuation moves the story toward a resolution of sorts, focusing on the characters' personal growth, their acceptance of the past, and their journey to embrace their own voices. Their reflections on Rachel Bellamy's legacy have led them to rewrite their own narratives, symbolizing the idea that legacy doesn't define us. It's how we interact with it that shapes our future. The office door clicked shut behind Lila. She stood for a moment, her hand resting on the knob, before she finally turned around and walked to the desk where her laptop sat open. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she hesitated. The manuscript she had worked on for months, the one that she thought might be the one to define her, felt unfinished. There was a finality to it, a sense of closure that left her feeling hollow. It wasn't the end she had envisioned. Her thoughts drifted back to the conversation she'd had with Iris the last time they met. "We can rewrite the story," she had said. But what did that even mean? Was it really possible to transform the narrative of her life? Could she truly find peace in her own identity, separate from the expectations that had followed her for so long? Lila closed her eyes and remembered the quiet chaos of her earlier years. The way her words had been shaped by Rachel, by the people around her, by the very institutions that had lauded her success. But her success had come with strings attached, strings that tied her to Rachel's ghost. And no matter how hard she tried to distance herself from it, the weight of it lingered. The lines between her own story and Rachel's blurred in ways she couldn't undo. Lila took a deep breath and opened a blank document on her laptop. She began to write, not the final chapter of her book, but something else. An acknowledgement, a letter of sorts, to the version of herself she had been before the world had turned her into someone else. Chapter 2. Reflections in the Mirror Iris sat at the window of her new apartment, watching the rain fall in thick sheets against the glass. It had been a year since The Lines Between Us had been published, and while the book had garnered critical praise, it had never reached the mass audience she had hoped for. But in many ways, that didn't matter anymore. The truth was, Iris had stopped chasing the kind of success that came with being the center of attention. She had grown comfortable with the quieter moments, of sitting in her small apartment with a cup of coffee and reading, of finding peace in the stories she wrote, even if they would never be part of the mainstream conversation. But there was a lingering sense of something unsaid, something unresolved. Her relationship with Rachel was no longer just a shadow. It was a part of her, woven into the fabric of who she was. Rachel's work had shaped her, had taught her what it meant to write, to explore the complexities of human emotion and experience. But the more she thought about it, the more Iris realized that her connection to Rachel had been complicated by something more, by the need for validation, for acknowledgement. She was tired of seeking approval from people who didn't truly understand her. It had been the same with her writing. She had spent so much time trying to prove herself, to measure up to some imagined standard, that she had almost lost sight of why she started writing in the first place. To understand herself. And that was the true legacy of Rachel Bellamy, Iris realized. The courage to tell your story, even when it means facing uncomfortable truths, even when the world doesn't understand. Rachel had written for herself first, and that was why her words had resonated so deeply with others. But it was time for Iris to do the same. Chapter 3. The conversation that almost wasn't. It had been months since Lila had sent the manuscript for her new book out for review, and now, as the time for feedback came closer, she couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. She had received positive notes from her editors, but there was a part of her that felt uneasy. It was almost as though the story was incomplete, like she had left something unsaid. She dialed Iris's number. The phone rang twice before Iris answered. "Hey, Lila." Iris's voice was warm, but there was something quieter in it than usual. "Hey," Lila replied, her voice a little shaky. "Can we meet?" There was a pause on the other end. "Of course. When?" "I don't know," Lila said, her mind racing. "Maybe soon. I've been thinking about our last conversation, and I don't think we're done talking yet." There was a flicker of understanding in Iris's voice. "I know what you mean. I've been feeling that too." They agreed to meet the following week, but the weight of their unfinished business hung between them. Both women had been processing their own internal conflicts, but they hadn't quite reached a point of clarity. There was still so much left, unsaid, so much they were afraid to confront even with each other. Chapter 4. Unraveling the Past. The night before their meeting, Lila sat up late, staring at her manuscript. She had reached the end, finally, And yet, it didn't feel like an end at all. It felt like a question, a hole in the center of everything she had written. She closed the document, took a deep breath, and opened the drawer to her desk. There, at the bottom, was the journal she had kept in the years before Rachel's death, before the book, before everything had spiraled out of control. It was filled with her thoughts from that time, the time when she had been struggling to come to terms with Rachel's betrayal, with the weight of the truth that had been revealed. Lila flipped through the pages, reading her own words. The pain was palpable in the ink, in the way she had tried to make sense of it all. She had written about betrayal, about the loss of trust, about the lies she had told herself. But now, as she read it, she realized something. The story she had been trying to tell wasn't just about Rachel. It was about her, about the ways in which she had deceived herself, about the lies she had told in the name of self-preservation. A shaky breath, Lila took a pen and began to write at the bottom of the last page. I can't keep writing this story like it's someone else's. It's mine. I have to take ownership of it, even the parts I wish I could forget. Especially those parts. Lila felt a rush of relief as she wrote those words. It was the beginning of something new, something she hadn't realized she needed until now. In that moment, she knew the story was far from over. The truth was still being written. Chapter 5. The Meeting. The coffee shop was crowded, but there was a quietness to the two women sitting at the table by the window. Their conversation was slow, deliberate, as they both took their time to process what they were saying. I think, Lila started, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, I've spent so much time trying to write a story that others would understand. But it was never about them. It was about me. And I've been so afraid to say that, to admit that I'm not just the keeper of Rachel's story, that I have one of my own. Iris nodded, her expression serious. I know what you mean. I spent so long thinking that I was only defined by Rachel's words. But in the end, it's not her story that I need to tell. It's mine. There was a long pause as they both sat, in the stillness of their thoughts, realizing the weight of what they had both discovered. I think we're both rewriting our own endings, Lila said, her voice quieter now. And that's the hardest part. Letting go of the idea that someone else's story has to define us. It's a gift, Iris replied, even if it doesn't feel like it sometimes. Lila smiled softly. Yeah, a gift. And as they sat, there together, the story of Rachel Bellamy, while still present in their lives, no longer held them captive. They were free, in their own ways, to choose what came next. The sun had barely risen when Lila found herself standing at the edge of the cliff, the cool wind tugging at her jacket. It was a quiet morning, the world still wrapped in a blanket of mist, and she had come here for the solitude, the space to think, to clear her head. The Pacific stretched out before her, vast and unknowable, much like the future she was still trying to comprehend. Her mind replayed the conversation with Iris, their words from the coffee shop still echoing in her thoughts. They had both admitted the same thing. They had been trying to live someone else's story. Now they were learning how to write their own. Lila closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the salt air, trying to shake off the weight of the past. It had been 2 weeks since that meeting, and since then she had been buried in editing her manuscript, refining it into something that felt more authentic, more honest. But even as she worked, something still gnawed at her, something unresolved. She had not yet made peace with Rachel's betrayal, nor had she fully forgiven herself for the ways she had allowed herself to be swept up in that world. One where lies were more comfortable than the truth, and silence was a refuge. The truth that Rachel had taken so much from her, but also had given her the tools to heal. She turned to leave the cliffside, her footsteps soft on the damp earth, when her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from Iris. I know it's early, but I'm coming by today. I need to talk. Can we meet? Lila's heart skipped a beat. It was unlike Iris to reach out with such urgency, especially after the deep conversation they had shared. What was left to discuss? She stared at the phone for a moment, debating, then typed a quick response. Of course, I'll be home in a few hours. There was a weight in the message, a tension that Lila couldn't quite place. But she knew Iris. She wasn't someone who asked for a meeting without a reason. Whatever had happened, it was something that couldn't be said through text. Chapter 2. An Unspoken Truth. Iris arrived at Lila's apartment just after lunch, her face pale and drawn, the exhaustion of something unspoken hanging over her. She sat down on the couch without a word, her hands clasped tightly together. Lila studied her for a moment before speaking. "What's going on, Iris?" Iris hesitated, her eyes avoiding Lila's gaze as she stared at the floor. When she spoke, her voice was thick, as though the words themselves were too heavy to bear. "I've been thinking about Rachel a lot lately," she said quietly. "About the things she did, the things she didn't say. I realized something that's been eating at me." Lila raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Iris finally looked up at her, her eyes searching, almost as though she was looking for permission to speak her truth. "I've been holding on to the idea of her for so long, Lila, and I think I've been letting her define me. I've been living as though her words, her legacy, her life were the only things that mattered. But the truth is, I'm still afraid of letting go, afraid of being irrelevant, of losing everything I thought I had." Lila's heart tightened in her chest. She could feel the weight of Iris's words in her own bones. They were both afraid, in different ways, of the same thing. "Iris," Lila said softly, leaning forward, "we've been carrying this burden for so long. It's not about Rachel anymore. It's about us, about what we choose to do with the pieces of our lives she left behind." Iris nodded, but the shadows in her eyes remained. "I know, but that's the thing. I'm terrified. Terrified of making the wrong choice, of erasing everything we've worked for. I've spent so many years trying to figure out who I am, but every time I come close, I realize I'm still tethered to her, to what she left us with." Lila felt her own chest constrict with empathy. "You don't have to erase her, Iris. You don't have to run from what she gave you. You're not defined by her, by any of it. You can still choose your own path. You can be both, her legacy and your own." There was a long silence between them as Iris processed the weight of Lila's words. Finally, she spoke again, her voice shaky but resolute. "I don't know if I can do it, Lila. I don't know if I'm strong enough to make the choice." Lila reached across the space between them and placed her hand over Iris's. "You already have," she said gently. "The choice is in front of you now. The only question left is, what do you want?" Iris looked down at their intertwined hands, and for the first time, a tear slipped from her eye. She had been so caught in the shadows of the past, so afraid of losing herself, that she had forgotten how to live for herself. "I want to live for me," she whispered. "I want to stop hiding behind what I think everyone expects me to be." Lila smiled softly. "Then do it. Let it go. You don't owe anyone anything except your truth." Chapter 3. The Cost of Freedom. The days following Iris's visit were filled with a quiet energy. There was no dramatic moment of resolution, no grand epiphany that solved everything. But both women had begun to make peace with their journeys. They had stopped looking for answers from others and started finding them within themselves. For Lila, this meant a return to the manuscript she had been avoiding. She had written herself into a corner, stuck between two identities, the writer, who lived in Rachel's shadow, and the writer who could stand alone. Now she wasn't so afraid of what she might find. She rewrote the final chapters with a steady hand, no longer afraid to let her own voice take shape on the page. For Iris, it meant embracing the uncertainty of her future. She hadn't made a decision about her next book yet, but she knew it. Had to be hers, and only hers. She wasn't ready to walk away from Rachel's influence completely, but she was learning to see it as just one thread in the tapestry of her own life. The fear of irrelevance had started to fade. One afternoon, Lila sent Iris an email with the subject line, "I finished it." It was the manuscript, finally complete. But more than that, it was a message of hope, a declaration that they could all move forward, despite the pain, despite the mistakes, despite the ghosts that haunted them. Iris read the email, her heart pounding. She sat there for a long while, letting the words sink in. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something shift, something that resembled peace. Chapter 4. The Future Awaits. It had been nearly a year since that final conversation. The first drafts of their futures had been written, but the final chapters were still unfolding. Lila and Iris continued their friendship, but something had shifted. There were still moments of hesitation, of doubt, of fear that crept in when the world grew too quiet. But the truth, the one that had been, buried beneath the years of silence, was out now. They had chosen to rewrite their lives. They had chosen to live for themselves. As Lila stood at the window of her apartment, gazing out at the horizon, she felt a sense of freedom that had eluded her for so long. She no longer needed to hold on to Rachel's legacy as a way to define who she was. She had become someone else, someone stronger, more herself than she had ever been. And in that moment, she realized something else, that even in the face of betrayal, in the face of loss, there was always the possibility of starting over. The future, though uncertain, was wide open. End. Lila sat at her desk, the pages of her manuscript scattered in front of her, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The gentle hum of her apartment was punctuated by the sound of her pen scratching paper, but it wasn't the words she was focused on. It was the sense of distance that had grown between her and Iris over the past few months. Though they had spoken a few times since their last meeting, there was something unresolved between them, an unspoken gap that neither of them had been willing to cross. Lila knew it was there, but part of her wondered if she was just being paranoid, if the fragility of their bond was something she had imagined. Still, as she stared out the window at the fading afternoon light, she couldn't ignore the quiet tension that had taken root in their friendship. It had been so easy to believe that once they both embraced their truths, everything would fall into place. But it hadn't worked like that. There were still shadows between them, unanswered. Questions, fears that they hadn't fully voiced. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her messages. But when she reached Iris's name, she stopped herself. They hadn't talked in over a week. Part of her wanted to reach out, but she wasn't sure if it was the right moment. What if Iris wasn't ready? What if she had finally decided to move on from their shared history? Her thumb hovered over the screen, but she set the phone back down. She needed to clear her head first. Chapter 2. The unspoken rift Iris had always prided herself on her ability to analyze things, to step back and look at a situation from every angle. But lately all she could see was the distance between her and Lila. It wasn't that anything had explicitly happened to cause the rift. It was just the silence. There had been too many unspoken moments, too many conversations left unfinished. And yet, despite all of that, she couldn't bring herself to reach out. Something was holding her back, some unacknowledged fear that had taken root when she least expected it. She was sitting in her apartment, the air thick with indecision. On her coffee table sat a draft of her own manuscript, pages filled with thoughts that she wasn't sure she was ready to share with anyone, let alone Lila. She had spent months writing it, working through the pain of the past, but now that it was nearing completion, she wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do. Was it enough? She wondered. Would it ever be enough? The fear of rejection, of being judged, of opening herself up to criticism in ways she hadn't been willing to before loomed large. She had chosen to embrace her truth, but that truth still felt so fragile, so exposed. With a sigh, Iris reached for her phone. She typed a message to Lila. "Can we talk soon? I think I'm ready to share something with you." She hesitated, her finger hovering over the send button. Was this the right moment? Was she truly ready? Before she could second-guess herself, she pressed send. Chapter 3. The Call to Action. The message from Iris hit Lila's phone just as she was about to leave for the evening. She stared at the words for a moment, her pulse quickening. "I think I'm ready to share something with you." What did that mean? What had Iris been holding back? Lila felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety coil in her chest. She had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the moment when their unspoken rift would be bridged, when the silence would finally be broken. She quickly responded, "Yes, I'll be there in an hour." The truth was, Lila had no idea what Iris was about to say, but she knew they had reached a critical juncture. Whatever had been festering between them, it couldn't be ignored any longer. The past year had been about their shared journey of self-discovery, but that journey wasn't over. It was still unfolding. As she drove toward Iris's apartment, Lila couldn't help but wonder how their dynamic would change after this conversation. What new truths would come to light, and could their friendship survive the weight of those truths? Chapter 4. The reckoning Iris opened the door, her face tight with something Lila couldn't quite place, nervousness maybe or apprehension. But there was also a glimmer of something else. Hope? Was that what it was? "Hey," Iris greeted, stepping aside to let Lila in. Her apartment was cozy, but tonight it felt quieter than usual, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something to break. "Hey," Lila replied softly, watching her closely as she entered. "What's going on? You said you were ready to share something." Iris gestured to the couch, motioning for Lila to sit. Her eyes were distant, as though she were still wrestling with whatever she had come to say. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was palpable. Finally, Iris took a deep breath and looked directly at Lila. "I've been working on my manuscript," she said slowly, her voice soft but steady. "And the more I write, the more I realize something that I've been afraid to admit. I've been holding on to Rachel's influence for so long that I forgot what it means to write for myself, to speak my truth without feeling like I'm copying her. I've been so terrified of being inadequate, of not living up to some expectation that I've been burying my own voice." Lila stayed quiet, letting the words settle, letting them sink in. "I thought I could rewrite my story. I thought I could stop being afraid. But I realized that the only way I'm ever going to truly write what matters to me is to let go of all the pressure of trying to be someone else. I have to stop being scared of what people will think and just be honest with myself." The weight of Iris's confession hung in the air, and Lila understood exactly what she meant. It wasn't just about writing, it was about living, about breaking free from the ghost of Rachel's shadow, about finally allowing themselves to exist on their own terms. "Iris," Lila said quietly, her voice full of understanding, "I get it. I've been afraid of the same thing. Afraid of letting go of the expectations, afraid of stepping away from what Rachel left behind. But what we've been carrying, it's not just Rachel's legacy, it's ours too. We're allowed to write our own stories, to make mistakes, to be scared. Iris nodded, her expression softening. I think I've finally realized that. I've been holding on to a version of her for so long that I forgot what it was like to be me, to let myself be afraid, but also free. Lila leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. We both have, but we don't have to keep hiding behind it. We can let go and still honor her, but we don't have to be defined by it, by her. We're allowed to be ourselves. For the first time in months, Lila saw something in Iris's eyes. Relief. A softening. She wasn't completely free yet, but she was closer than she had ever been. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people finally understand each other, finally see each other for who they truly are. Chapter 5. The beginning of something. New later. That evening, Lila and Iris sat on the couch, talking more freely than they had in ages. They talked about their writing, their fears, and their hopes for the future. There was a sense of camaraderie between them that had been missing for too long, a shared understanding of the journey they were both on. As Lila stood to leave, she turned to Iris with a small, thoughtful smile. We're both allowed to be afraid, you know, she said softly. But we don't have to let that stop us anymore. Iris smiled back, her eyes bright with something unspoken. I know. And for the first time in a long time, I think I'm okay with that. And as Lila left, she knew that this was just the beginning, of healing, of new stories to be written, of a future that was still unfolding. Both of them had taken the first steps toward letting go of the past, toward claiming the lives they wanted to lead, and while the road ahead was still uncertain, it was theirs to walk. End.